Thank you to the worship team this morning. I want you to turn your Bibles this morning to 1 Samuel chapter 18. 1 Samuel chapter 18. Last week we left David after his victory over Goliath. He now has made himself known to Saul. We know from 1 Samuel 16 that David was in the palace of Saul as he would comfort Saul when Saul had an evil spirit tormenting him. And then the narrator relates to us in 1 Samuel 18 many emotions of five major characters in this chapter: David, Saul, Jonathan, Michal, and the people of Israel. And there's also much talk in this chapter about love, specifically a love towards David. So let's go through this chapter. I'm going to paraphrase this for you again this morning, as I trust that you have read it, and let's pay attention to the many emotions in our story. So 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1. The souls of David and Jonathan are knit together. In verse 3, Jonathan cut a covenant with David because Jonathan loved him as his own soul. In verse 4, Jonathan gave David his robe. Verse 5, David prospers in battle. Verse 6, and when David returned from striking down the Philistine Goliath, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with gladness, and with musical instruments. Verse 7, and they sang and were merry and said, Saul has struck his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And verse 8, another emotion here, Saul became very angry. So verse 9, he looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Verse 10, then an evil spirit came upon Saul. Verse 11, so he hurled a spear at David. And verse 15, Saul dreaded David. Verse 16, but all Israel and Judah loved David. Verse 17, Saul devised a plan to have David marry his daughter Merab. But David seems to say no, and so she marries someone else. But verse 20, Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. Verse 21, and Saul is pleased with this, for he thought that this would pit the Philistines against David, and so he convinced David to marry Michal. But the price tag is 100 dead Philistines. But Saul's plan is that David would die in battle. Verse 27, yet David returns after killing 200 Philistines. And verse 28, so David gets Michal and becomes the hero in Israel. So we have in this story that Jonathan loved David, verse 1. All Israel and Judah loved David, verse 16. Michal loved David, verse 20 and 28. And all Saul's servants loved David, verse 22. And we know that David loved Jonathan. We read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 1. Whereas Saul was angry toward David in verse 8. Suspicious of David in verse 9. Afraid of David in verse 12 and 29. He dreaded David in verse 15. And he schemed against David in verse 25. And all these emotions are caused, or at least magnified, by the one major event, the killing of Goliath. And we can understand this, as Israel's been in terror for 6 weeks, as their demise was rather certain, until David rescues them from their fate. And you can imagine the reaction of all the people as this news spread, that David was the one who killed the great Philistine. And the strange thing with David is, just prior to all this, he was not known by anyone. He was so little known. Even among his family, he was considered very ordinary. This was not like a 10-year-old Wayne Gretzky who was known at age 10 as the next Gordie Howe. Apparently at age 10, during that one hockey season, Gretzky scored 378 goals and had 517 points. And when he was 16, he was already playing with 18 and 20-year-olds. But nobody knew about David. So let's begin with this relationship this morning between David and Jonathan. The story begins with this great relationship between these two. And one of the reasons is that it's so unique to the reader is that it's David who has already been anointed as king. He is the one who has done for Israel what Saul should have done. And then we have Jonathan, who is the king's son, and in the eyes of the majority of Israel would be the next king. I guess it would be necessary too also to comment at this point as well that unlike what's been suggested by many modern commentators, that there was some kind of improper sexual relationship between David and Jonathan. We read in 2 Samuel 1 that David's love for Jonathan was more wonderful to him than the love of a woman. Yet an improper relationship between them is indicated nowhere in the Bible. It's only something that some have suggested given the climate of our own culture. And I want to give you three reasons here quickly why the text gives no indication of an improper love relationship between the two. The Hebrew word used between them for love, it is used many times throughout the Old Testament for friendship. It's used actually how to love a foreigner. It's used to how to love a neighbor. Secondly, when David expressed his love for Jonathan, he simply expressed the great commitment that they had for each other. And of course, the third reason is endorsing a sexual love between these two men goes directly against Old Testament law, and even more importantly for us, it would contradict Paul's teaching against homosexuality in Romans chapter 1. But obviously, these two men were very good friends. They were willing to sacrifice for each other. Jonathan had many times defended David, and later Jonathan saves David's life. God Questions Ministry wrote that rather than being evidence for a homosexual relationship in the Bible, the account of David and Jonathan is an example of true biblical friendship. As true friendship, according to the Bible, involves loyalty, sacrifice, compromise, and yes, it also involves an emotional attachment. I trust that we have these kinds of relationships with other Christians, both men and women. And the Bible tells us that everyone loved David, except for Saul. And it's rather remarkable that Jonathan loved David, as it was Jonathan earlier in the account that he was the mighty warrior. He was actually doing things that Saul was not doing. We've already read how Jonathan had defeated many Philistines before this. In other words, if Jonathan had a reason to feel jealous about David, as his father Saul did, he had every reason. Yet we read from the beginning that Jonathan was knit together to the soul of David. And that term being knit together likely means that they also enjoyed each other greatly. You know those relationships that you have, where you just enjoy the company of someone that you are just completely relaxed with, and you have spent much time together, you laugh together, and you likely have much in common. In verse 1, Jonathan loved David as his own soul. This expresses more than just an enjoyment of each other. It gives the idea of a commitment to each other that would last. I think of the words "I do" in a marriage ceremony. That through all the things that we face in life, the "I do" means that we will never break that commitment with each other. This is why it tells us next at verse 3, Jonathan cut a covenant with David. And though we don't completely understand what such a covenant would mean between these two men, we do get hints of this later on. In chapter 20, verse 8, David said to Jonathan, "Therefore show loving kindness to me." And then David reminded Jonathan of the covenant. And he says, "For you have brought me into a covenant of Yahweh with yourself." So this covenant must mean a pact with each other, that they would always love each other, always protect each other, and always be committed to each other. And then Jonathan gives in verse 4 David his robe. We can likely assume that this is a robe that David would have, that other than having Jonathan's robe would never be able to afford such a robe. It would also likely be assigned to others, that David and Jonathan had a special relationship with each other. It's interesting to note here that when Samuel warned Saul that the kingdom was being taken away from him, It tells us in chapter 15 that Saul grabbed part of Samuel's robe, signifying that the kingdom was being torn from him. And here Jonathan gives his royal robe to the next king, David. So the next encounter we have here in this chapter is David and Saul. David and Saul. And we read in verse 2, "And Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house." This likely aligns with the latter half of 1 Samuel 16, where David was brought into the palace to play the harp for Saul. And back then we read that Saul loved David, which was likely after his encounter with Goliath. But prior to all this praise that David was receiving from the people of Israel. Look with me at verse 5. "So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul sent him over the men of war." Here we see that not only was David acting as Saul's music guy, but because he had become such a great warrior in killing Goliath, he was also used in the king's service in battle. The timeline here is difficult to understand. There must be some time here between David's rise to fame by killing Goliath and his accolades at the end of 1 Samuel 17, where it says that Israel pursued the Philistines and plundered their camps. This would account for a time when Saul had David placed in some strategic leadership position. We're not given how long this may have gone on. The phrase there, that he pursued the Philistines. When we read that, we sort of assume it's the course of the same day after he killed Goliath. But there must be some time here in between, weeks or even months, when David is leading this attack of the Philistines. And now David is returning, and his fame with Goliath and his other accolades in battle are becoming known. And we would perceive Saul as feeling pretty good about himself in promoting David, making himself look good and having a look at the great warrior in my army. Until, of course, David starts to get all the accolades that Saul is not receiving. Verse 6, "And it happened as they were coming, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, that the women came out of the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with gladness, and with musical instruments. And the women sang as they were merry and said, 'Saul has struck his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying was displeasing in his eyes. And he said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have with the kingdom?'" Nothing worse, is it, when somebody else gets the praise? When someone else scores the goal and you did all the work to set it up. Well, of course, in this case, when David scores the goal and somehow Saul feels he's the one that sent David out on the ice, sort of that boo-hoo, right? Pity me. After all the things that I did. Nothing worse than when you play first base in Elim two-pitch and you cheer and you run your heart out, and then someone like Zach or Scott gets one swing and they get a home run and they get all the accolades, right? Kidding aside, this is an event that can really happen. It certainly can rear its ugly head in Christianity and churches, where someone may be very gifted in an area, and then somebody else comes along who's better. Good to be thankful for those who are gifted in leadership, and yet they are able to rejoice when someone else comes along to the forefront who may be better. I witnessed this firsthand from Pastor Phil Stairs, who so graciously saw a younger Pastor Rick Baker, Emmanuel Chatham, who was beginning to take more leadership as they continued to minister together as a senior pastor and associate. Those two remained good friends for their entire lives, and Rick Baker led Phil's funeral service. Yet here Saul is the warrior, And he did have to share his victories and praises. But now David becomes the main man. He's not happy. I bet the fact that David was a great harpist didn't bother Saul at all. It was that David was receiving praise for his wartime greatness here. Something that Saul would be thinking, this is mine, this is mine. It'd be interesting as I read this, if these women knew the trouble they were causing this day. I just thought maybe if they just changed their words slightly to their little chorus, right? Where the chorus might have just positioned David just a little bit under Saul. I did smile when I read that these women came with this song to David. Actually, no, it says in verse 6, the women came out singing and dancing to meet King Saul. King Saul, talk about rubbing it in your face. Sounds like they were wanting to rub this in a little. That's the problem of being on top, isn't it? When you're king, even when you're Wayne Gretzky, at some point Alex Ovechkin is going to break your record. And even if you're the most heralded entertainer, the best actor, the best singer, the top athlete in any sport, all you need to do is just wait a few years and someone else will be better. If you're the Kansas City Chiefs and you're on top of the world and NFL champions for a couple of years until the Philadelphia Eagles come along. You know, it was just 5 chapters earlier in our study we read that all Israel had heard the news that Saul had struck the garrison of the Philistines. He was at the top of his game until David killed his tens of thousands. In verse 8, Saul is very angry. In verse 9, he kept an eye on David from that day on. You know, it was like Saul went to bed at night, and what was he thinking? David, David, David. Saul would wake up in the morning, what is he thinking? David, David, David. Alistair Begg said, jealousy will destroy a marriage, disrupt a family, bust a business, neutralize a sports team, create absolute chaos in a church leadership, and reduce a church family to bare bones. The Apostle James wrote that whenever there's jealousy and selfish ambition occur, there is disorder and evil. And then, of course, Saul's jealousy here turns to hatred. As all Saul is thinking, I hate that guy. And in this case, David actually has done nothing against Saul. But our evil emotions, you know, they don't necessarily have to have a good reason. Especially if we begin to feel pity for ourselves or we're being driven by jealousy. It's odd that we read verse 12 that Saul was afraid of David. Here is Saul with the spear. Here is Saul with the authority. Saul is the king, and he's fearing the young shepherd boy. There's so much difference between the heart of these two men. The Spirit of God has left Saul, and then we read twice in verse 12, Yahweh was with David. Verse 14, Yahweh was with him. And in this case, the people would have seen this as well. They must have seen the success of David over Saul. And it's significant that the passage, verse 16, that all Israel and Judah loved David. As we are already seeing a rift here between Israel and Judah that will become apparent after David's son Jonathan or Solomon. But here it's not just David's tribesmen that love him. It tells us here that all of Israel loved him. All the tribes of Israel loved him. All the conservatives, all the liberals, and all the Democrats loved him. Now, if we were asked to consider each of the characters in our story this morning, what would we say? How would we describe David? Faithful, humble, loyal. He's the hero. How would we describe Jonathan? A devoted friend of David? A sensible son of Saul, loyal to his dad? Saul, how would we describe him? Unpredictable, insecure, jealous, and at times evil. And this comes to light again as David is the one who has delivered Israel. And then we read in verse 13, "Therefore Saul turned him away from his presence and appointed him as his commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the king." So then it may surprise us that Saul would do this. Look at the beginning of verse 17. "Then Saul said to David, 'Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be a man of valor for me and fight Yahweh's battle.'" Now, we've heard the previous promise of Saul here last week that whoever would kill Goliath would be given the king's daughter. Yet now it seems to come with another condition, middle of verse 17, that "I will give her to you as a wife, only be a man of valor for me and fight Yahweh's battles." Yet we also know that this was only for the purpose of David, hopefully getting killed in battle. End of verse 17, "For Saul thought, 'My hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him.'" In other words, he might be thinking here, sure, David had a lucky shot at that big Philistine, but let's see how he tackles 1,000 Philistines. So now not only is Saul against David, but he's actually pulling for the Philistines in battle. And then we read verse 18. "But David said to Saul, 'Who am I, and what is my life for my father's family in Israel, that I should be the king's son-in-law?' So it happened at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel the Meholathite as a wife." What's not clear in these verses is whether David refuses this offer, as he says here, "Who am I?" and choosing not to marry Merab, or if Saul simply reneged on his offer. Now, it would seem that some time passes before verse 20, which introduces something more to the plot. And it says here in verse 20, tells us here of the love that Michal, Saul's daughter, had for David. Now, when we read verse 20, that Michal loved David and it was told to Saul, my first response would be that Saul was going to blow up at this, but he seems quite good with this. Verse 21. "And Saul said, 'I will give her to him, that she may become a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him.' Therefore Saul said to David, 'For a second time you may be my son-in-law today.'" This would also confirm that the reason that Merab was not given to David likely had more to do with David's refusal than to Saul's unwillingness. So Saul seems quite happy here at this point to try this again. And when we read that Michal loved David, we don't know for sure what this love entailed, how devoted this was. Though we will find out next week, she will try to protect David. In other words, Michal may have loved David, however, for what he's accomplished, for who he was. He was marrying someone who had this great honor. It's hard to know here. But we do know Jonathan's love for David was due to his great commitment to David. His devotion is really proven as his support of David in anything would steal from him some of the honor that would have been his if Saul's kingly line had continued. Certainly Jonathan seemed to support David whether he gained from it or not. And so Saul makes sure this time the plan will work. He doesn't hesitate to say whatever he needs to say to benefit himself. Verse 22. "So Saul commanded his servants speak to David secretly, saying, 'Behold, the king delights in you, and all his servants love you. So now become the king's son-in-law.'" Well, we know that David agrees, and Saul is glad to propose to David the challenge with one goal in mind, that David, hopefully, in Saul's eyes, would be killed in battle. And it would seem that Saul was certain that David would jump at the opportunity to fight the Philistines. Saul seems to know David at this point quite well. And I do like the way in which Saul tried to get these men to entice David, beginning of verse 26. "Then his servants told David these words, and it was right in the eyes of David to become the king's son-in-law." I smile at this point at the enticement was to become the king's son-in-law here. Anne's maiden name is Ballinger. And I know I call Ann Okie all the time, but sometimes if we're goofing around, I will call her Ann Ballinger. Ann Ballinger. And the idea of being Don Ballinger's son-in-law is nice. It really is. Ann had a great dad. Ann's dad was involved greatly in ministry. He greatly supported me as his son. Ann's dad was loved by many. But it was not the heart of the plan when I proposed to Ann on December 30th, 1980. Now, it'd be fun to watch this story as a movie, to see the look on Saul's face after killing not 100 Philistines, which was the price tag, but he actually comes back with 200 Philistines. And you have to give David some credit here, as he's somewhat the competitive sword, isn't he? This would not have been the most pleasant undertaking. And this shock to Saul reminds me of the story of Esther, where Haman believes that he is the one to be honored, only to find out that his arch enemy is the one who will be honored. And then we read this strange statement in verse 28. Then Saul saw and knew that Yahweh was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. So Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Talk about things here going from bad to worse for Saul. He tries to have David killed in battle, yet because of his exploits, he's highly esteemed in Israel. And then we read verse 30, that the commanders of the Philistines went out to battle, and it happened as often as they went out that David behaved himself more insightfully than all the servants of Saul, so his name was highly esteemed. And of course, Saul's plan included to give the king's daughter, Michal, to David, which now makes the presence of David even a greater threat to Saul, as David now is part of Saul's family. Well, I thought, what can we take from this fascinating story? Much is told in this story to us about love and loyalty, and we learn much from this story about hatred and fear. And if we wanted to simplify this chapter, we could say that there was love and loyalty on the part of Jonathan towards David, and there was hatred and fear on the part of Saul towards David. But then there's others in this story who express a love for David. And then, of course, there's David himself, who had a love and loyalty towards Jonathan, but also the people of Israel. He certainly had a love and loyalty to God, but he even has a love and loyalty to Saul. And what we need to understand in this story is that David is the chosen king. He is the one we said a few weeks ago that the Lord has set his heart upon. This is his choice. This is the choice that God has determined for his people to follow. So as we continue in our story, we're going to see that David is going to fail in some areas of his role that he was given by God. But we know that the point of the story in the scriptures is not the greatness of David. The story is given to us because of the greatness of his successor, Jesus Christ. Yet the key here in our story is God's choice. And therefore we see the response toward God's choice here in 1 Samuel 18. It's not surprising that when David's successor comes in the New Testament, Jesus said this, "He who is not with me is against me." And we see many of the same reactions to Christ in the New Testament as we see towards David here in the Old Testament. Many heard Christ, God's chosen king, but they reacted by rejecting him. The Bible tells us that some even picked up stones to kill him. And we know that ultimately they put Christ on a cross, the Lord's chosen Messiah king. Listen to the words of Peter as he preached in Acts chapter 4. He said, "Why did the Gentiles rage? The people devise vain things. The kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ." Peter preached these words. He was quoting from the Old Testament. In fact, he quoted the exact words of King David in Psalm 2. We might say, here's the moral of the story, that no one can have a neutral stance toward God's King or his chosen Christ. John Woodhouse wrote that the world would love to think that they can be neutral towards Jesus this morning. For who would want to oppose a man who did so much good and a man who taught us to love our enemies? Many today would not describe themselves as believers, but neither would they describe themselves as an unbeliever. They may say, I'm not against Christianity, but neither am I really for Christianity. But remember what Jesus said. Whoever is not with me is against me. And this comes into view in the story of David as Saul opposes God's choice. Some at least acknowledge some kind of allegiance to him. But we also know that many like Saul started out loving David, but that love would not last. It was the same with those who followed Christ. We read in John 6:66, as a result of this, many of Jesus' disciples went away and were not walking with him anymore. Yet while Jonathan loved David dearly and devoted himself to God's king, there were also those in the New Testament who devoted themselves to Christ. Folks, this is the only kind of devotion that Jesus demands from you and I. Jesus declares this kind of devotion for himself. Luke wrote this. He said, now many crowds were going along with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. This is the call of the Lord's King, as there is no neutrality here. Woodhouse wrote this about David. He said, if you do not throw your lot in with David, as Jonathan so gladly did, sooner or later you would fear him and hate him, as Saul so tragically did. This morning, Jesus Christ is reigning. Christ the Lord is risen today. Up from the grave he arose. But not many are aware, are they? Not many live as if this was the theme of their life. A little like David's anointing, not many were aware at this point. Yet someday King David would come to the throne, and someday every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. No one is neutral. And the question this morning on this Easter Sunday is, where's your heart this morning? Have you embraced the King who God has anointed? Do you love him? Are you devoted to him? Are you loyal to him? And we could say about our risen Lord, as Woodhouse said about David, that if you do not throw your lot in with Christ, sooner or later you will fear him and you will hate him. We need to be reminded of the centurion, as we were reminded this morning, as he saw the Lord's King, when he said, surely this man is the Son of God. I was reading the words of Charles Spurgeon. He said, you may lose a great deal for Christ, but you will never lose anything by Christ. You may lose for a time, but you will gain for an eternity. If you do not place your complete submission to God's chosen King this morning, someday the Bible teaches that we will fear him. Let's pray. Father, we pray that as we consider our hearts this morning on this Easter Sunday, that you have been resurrected, that we would consider our loyalty to your King, your chosen one. We celebrate that he is risen today. And therefore, might we be a people who would be willing to leave everything and follow our King. God's choice. And all God's people said, amen.